non-stop, what they call incessantly, then work some odd job just to live life pleasantly. Already got lost in my mind, not a fantasy, I'm getting with a forgotten soul, so stop, drop, and roll. You lost all control and pop off your ball. I got squat, I fold, I'm not.
Yeah, it's our time to shine. Show that's the kind of state of mind you gotta combine with hard work and time. You gotta climb to the top. Don't let yourself drop till your heart stops. Let this beat rock. Got a new clock and a new stock for this new rock. Just let your mind loose from the new stock. Drunk off the goose, yeah. Thinking that I'm too pop. Getting caught with a few thoughts cause I'm too lost. Off the speakers can't even handle me. Give it what I got, nobody's gonna drain my energy. And I will never stop, I'm motivated by enemies. Setting up shop so everybody remember me. And though I am not going through life regretfully, I'd rather work non-stop, what they call incessantly, then work some odd job just to live life pleasantly. Already got lost in my mind, not a fantasy, I'm getting with a forgotten soul, so stop, drop, and roll. You lost all control and pop off your ball. I got squat, I fold, I'm not bought, I'm sold. My stock rocks, it's gold. Hey, knock, knock, she holding shit, talk to close. I ain't stopping though, it's hip-hop, you know. Or is it rock and roll? I'm not dropping down, no, my pocket's grown. You can't stop the show, so get rockin' on. So let me break it all down for you.
I ain't never giving up, I ain't never giving up.
Taking that crown from you.
I ain't worried about you, I ain't never.
So let me break it all for you.
I ain't never giving up, I ain't never giving up. About you, I ain't never.
Keep on going till I'm down. No, I'm never slowing down cause we're blowing up now.
Yo.
Slowing down, keep on going till I'm down.
Here we are. Sorry I'm late.
No, I'm never slowing down cause we're blowing up. Hard words like a weapon, attack with no questions. In my own section and they still disconnected cause their mind's been infected and they're filled with objection. Too filled for recollection, so we're losing all attention. They don't know I'm in contention cause I'm gaining their attention. Cause I'm making a connection. Lyricism and aggression got me feeling my ascension. In my passion, my profession, I'm attacking my obsession. Taking action and progressing. I go off on the enemy, that's what makes them scared of me. Make my plans carefully, then execute them daringly. They say I act recklessly, but that's why I'm effective. See, you can't predict my tendencies, I offer no transparency. Some people think I'm lost, others think I'll be a legend. I'm never gonna stop till I'm one above second. And my thoughts at the top, but my mind stay present. Don't let your dreams stop, cause dreaming is a blessing.
Alright, so we are up, we are live, we are working. Let's do this. We're gonna do Canaan. We'll probably just do Jimmy Akin's stuff tonight, and then tomorrow do Gavin Ortland. It's probably just going to be a two-nighter, and then come Thursday evening, I'm going to be doing an open room on Eva Lupine's video on religion and kink. That's going to be an interesting one. I did reach out to her yesterday. I didn't get a response on her guesting on the show. Hey, Tux. But I will try again tomorrow, see if I can get her to come on Thursday, even if it's just for a little 5-minute or 10-minute discussion. Like I said, I don't know if she's gonna do it. She did respond, but she didn't give a thumbs up or anything like that to actually on the show. Okay, let's do this. So we are going to do. Whoops, that's not it. You're seeing analytic stuff. How do I change this? Change. Yeah. All right. So we are going to do Jimmy Akin. We're going to do Gavin Ortland. There's going to be 2 parts to Gavin Ortland. The first one's kind of not very deep. The second one is really heavy. So we might, tomorrow night, we might do only part of Gavin Ortland's first video, and then do all of Kevin Ortland's second video on the topic.
Catholicism. Today, I'm here with the one and only Jimmy Akin to talk about the conquest of Canaan. Jimmy, this is a bit of a heavy topic, but I think the way you approached it on capturing Christianity was brilliant. And I saw a lot of people in the comment section saying, we want to hear Jimmy's perspective. You kind of alluded to it in the presentation, but they wanted to really hear you flesh it out. And so I'm more than happy to give you the platform.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here and, always happy to do whatever I can to help folks.
So for those that don't know, my take on the Canaanite story is that literarily it fits within the function of the narrative in the Bible. Outside of outside of the literary function of when we go to the actual history, it didn't happen. Was there warfare? Definitely. Was it with the Israelites? Maybe. Did the Israelites even exist as a group and culture at that time? Distinct from the Canaanite culture? Probably not. And the actions that happened didn't take place, but they are general enough that they do reflect the reality of warfare at that time that they're speaking of, and the reality of the warfare just a little bit after. So it would be like if you read some of the Japanese stories of the Sengoku period, they're actually written afterwards, and they're reflecting back. Then they're reflecting chivalric, knightly or samurai morals that didn't exist at the time of the actual Sengoku War period. And this also happens with the Chinese fictions in the Chinese Sengoku period. So you have this interesting version where you have the annuals, which are, where are they? I got them up here. So you have the annuals, which cover the real history, and then you have the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which covers the fictionalized version of it. I feel that's what the Conquest of Canaan is. That doesn't mean there's not any real history in there to grasp at. It just means that the story itself is functioning as a literary narrative first, and functioning as history, maybe treasurarily, because it's going to be the literary, then the moral, religious, theological importance, and then after that, whatever history is being filtered through. All right, let's rock.
Well, Jimmy, but I guess, is there anything you want to say before we get started?
Nope.
Okay. Then let's just first begin with some of the possible approaches or interpretations that one can have regarding the conquest of Canaan. You mentioned these three during your interview on Capturing Christianity.
I might get up in a second to get some water.
Just, I guess, to kind of set the stage for folks, what we're talking about is certain passages in the Old Testament where that are associated with the entrance of the Israelites into the Promised Land, which was known as Canaan and was already inhabited by people known as Canaanites. And in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, and in particular in Genesis, it talks about how the Canaanites were committing great moral crimes, things like child sacrifice and so forth. And this is fleshed out a little bit in the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, where it talks about various Canaanite practices, and Moses tells the Israelites on God's behalf that they're to repudiate these practices, they're not to engage in them, and they are abominable. And then in preparing the Israelites to go into Canaan at the end of the Exodus experience, in Deuteronomy, God, in a few passages, uses language that seems to command the extermination of the Canaanites, not simply defeating them militarily, but wiping them out. Not just the adult fighting men, but the women, the children, just get rid of the Canaanites. And then we have in the follow-on to the Pentateuch, in the book of Joshua, where they actually go into the land, we have a repetition of some of this language. There's a particular custom in the ancient world known in Hebrew as harem, which is often translated into English as the ban. And so if you put someone under harem or under the ban, it was a sort of religious act where you would effectively exterminate whatever it is that's under the ban as a kind of act of faith. And so we have some of this language. Sometimes harem, the term, is present, sometimes it's not. But basically, these passages are very disturbing to modern sensibilities. And, we live in a century. Within the last 100 years, there have been multiple cases of genocide, attempts to exterminate different people, the most famous being ironically, the attempted extermination of the Jewish people themselves by the Nazis in the 20th century. And as a result, we live in an age where people have a strong emotional reaction against this kind of language. And critics of Christianity, including atheists, and biblical religion in general, like Richard Dawkins and so forth, they'll point to these passages and say, how can you possibly explain this? Well, that's not a new question, because Christians, from the beginning have been taught, beginning with our Lord, a love your neighbor as yourself ethic. And so it has been a question, what do we make of these passages? That's been a question throughout Christian history. And you find very early Christian authors, like, for example, the early Christian writer Origen, wrestling with these passages and saying, how do we understand them? And basically, classically, there have been 2 approaches that have been, originally there were sort of two approaches. They've modified somewhat and become three. The original two approaches were first one was to take a literalist approach and say these passages mean exactly what they seem to mean on first reading, and God really did command the Israelites to, in some cases, exterminate the Canaanites to the last person, and for one reason or another, that was okay. And then the question would be, how can you justify that? How can you say why it's okay? And you had thinkers like, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who would say, well, God has the right to determine how much life a person receives, and even though we are not under ordinary circumstances permitted to take innocent human life, God has rights that we don't, and therefore God can intervene to suspend what normally we would be able to do, and he can authorize us. If he tells us to take a life, then it's okay, because we're not doing that on our own authority. We don't have the right to determine that an innocent is to die, but God does, and therefore if God tells you to take an innocent life, then you could do that.
So that's just basically that's basic divine command theory. I know a lot of atheists and anti-theists who watch my channel have a problem with that, but I've always been comfortable with divine command theory. It's not something that bothers me.
There are more refined ways of saying that. I would say it a bit differently today, but I'm trying to mirror the kind of language that Aquinas would have used. I would put it a little differently myself if I were defending that position. The other early position that you had that was, for example, advocated by Origen, was to essentially spiritualize these passages. And in doing that,
what's going on?
Advocates of this position would say, well, really what these passages are meant to do is not teach us anything about history, but to teach us a spiritual lesson. So we can kind of set aside what the human author was intending to do and just look at the spiritual lesson that God has for us in these texts. And that would be something like have nothing to do with paganism. Get rid of the paganism, set it aside, do whatever it takes. Kind of like when Jesus says in the Gospels.
Yeah, you all still there? Anyone still there on the show? Anyone still in the room? I don't know what just happened. Everything shut down and came back up.
If your hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. It's better to enter into heaven.
And I do agree with Origen, by the way. I'm pretty much reading John Christensen and Origen. I agree with almost everything that both of them say. I side slightly more with Origen than with John Christensen. In reading Augustine, I think he's great, but I don't always agree with him. I'm going to put myself on mute for a few seconds and let them talk. I am still going to be here, but I need to talk to my wife for a second.
Been maimed or, without a hand or an eye, than it is to go to hell. And so Christian scholars down throughout the ages have recognized that as an example of hyperbole, that Jesus doesn't literally mean cut off your hand if you sin with your hand or pluck out your eye if you look too long at an attractive woman. This is hyperbole. It really just means do whatever you have to deal with sin. But the key thing about this spiritualizing interpretation is it essentially ignores the literal interpretation of the text, which is what the human author is trying to do. And for that reason, as later Christian authors like Aquinas retrieved the importance of the literal sense of the text. You need to take account. This doesn't mean reading everything literalistically, but you do need to take serious account of what the human author of the text is trying to communicate to his audience. That's the literal sense of the text, and that's the foundation of any other senses. So you can't just ignore the literal sense of the text and leap to a spiritualized interpretation. You have to take what the human author is trying to do seriously. And so that led to a kind of modification, which is one of the three theories that we have today that are common. The first theory is still the literal one that says these mean what they say and it's okay because God has rights we don't. The second is a modified understanding that says actually if you look at what the human author was doing, he was doing something much more like the spiritual interpretation than was at first obvious. The literal sense of the text really is not kill these Canaanites, but instead the literal sense really is have nothing to do with paganism. And it.
So I do agree with Jimmy here, but I don't think that this is the best way to approach these texts. I do think looking at it first as a literary composition on its own away from the Bible is the better first approach, and then looking at it in these different views and different interpretations. Like I said, I have that list of 7 ways. I think that's the better way to go.
That's just expressed hyperbolically, the way Jesus uses hyperbole when he says cut off your hand or pluck out your eye in order to deal with sin. Jesus doesn't mean that literalistically, but the literal sense of what Jesus says is something like do whatever it takes to deal with sin. And in the same way, the second proposal in its modified form, which is not pure spiritualism anymore because it's trying to incorporate the literal sense of the text, says the literal sense of the text is have nothing to do with paganism. That's really what's being said here. That's what the human author of the text is trying to communicate to his audience. Then more recently, now, one of the classic assumptions in Christianity has always been that the texts of the Bible individually are divinely inspired in such a way that you can take a particular text, if you can figure out its meaning, it's going to be guaranteed to be true. But more recently, there have been alternatives proposed that have said, well, maybe we don't need to be biblical inerrantists, like C.S. Lewis was someone who was not a full biblical inerrantist. Or maybe biblical inerrancy works in a different way than we've historically assumed. And actually, as we can get into this, Pope Benedict actually made comments that seem to move in that direction. But as a result of this reevaluation of the issue of biblical inerrancy, there's been sort of a third position open up, which would be that the Bible contains passages where the human author is expressing a view that is in fact incorrect, that the human author is saying something that is mistaken, and that applies to these passages, that God didn't really command this, and the idea that God did command this stuff is simply mistaken. The human author was a creature.
So when I was first discerning Catholicism, returning to Catholicism when I was a lapsed Catholic, I ran into this theory a lot, especially, I don't know which Bible commentary it was, that would express this idea that these are, so I've expressed this many times, that I view the Bible as the history of the Jewish people as understood by Jewish people, and they're reframing their understanding of their relationship to God and their relationship to the world in these writings. And because they happen to get it right, we as Christians are also looking at this history as this is the divine history, the history of the relationship of man to God that is the most correct. So these commands could have just been a command given by a general, and the general may have said to do something terrible, but because the Jewish people didn't understand God properly yet, they think that God was commanding them to kill all these people, but he never gave this command. This was just their understanding of what God was commanding them to do. And this fits if you look at the Bible as a univocal voice, as Dan likes to say. I don't like that term, but I'm going to keep using it just to annoy people. And that does make sense, because if you look at Psalms, you look at Proverbs, you're going to get a different understanding of God than you will from looking at Chronicles and Judges and Joshua. That being said, we cannot, even if we take this approach, we cannot deny that the Bible says that God said these things. So either the Bible is recording a mistake, the authors have an intention by recording this mistake, or there's something else going on here, and there's something mistaken in our understanding of God if we're going to go with the all-loving, yada, yada, yada stuff about God that comes out of theology after the Bible is done. So we need to, I know, honey, I'm sorry. So I do think that that's important to keep in mind. I'm going to let Jimmy keep going. Tux, if you have an opinion on this, please share it, and I'll read it on the, if you have an opinion on this version of it, which is that the Jewish people are recording their understanding of what God said, but it might not actually be what God said, and how that congeals with the Protestant understanding of their version of infallibility and all that.
Creature of his times. He thought the way ancient Israelites thought, and so he may believe that God was commanding all this, but that's not actually true. And in order to figure out what the real truth is, we need to incorporate the revelation of Jesus Christ, which has, love God and love your neighbor as the two highest commandments. And so we can only understand these disturbing passages in the Old Testament in the light of Jesus Christ and what he would have us say. And so
and also, I would agree with because that's kind of, I know he said origin, but that's kind of more John Christensen's way of viewing it, is you're going to have to view everything in the Old Testament through Christ. So every passage in the Old Testament, you have to now you have to adjust your view, readjust your lens, change your lens even, and look through it through what it's pointing to toward Christ. And once you do that, all of this stuff, kind of fades away and you can kind of make sense of it. Now, I was just listening to Bart Ehrman's latest video where someone was talking about VeggieTales, which I know a lot of Catholics don't like that program either. But it was, I guess, someone who had become an atheist through her studies of the Bible, through seminary, or whatever it is, whatever kind of religious program there is in the school that Bart Ehrman teaches. And she's a former student of his as well. So she was saying that she doesn't think this is a valid approach, but it is the approach many of the church fathers use. So to me, it's valid. But that's because I agree with the church fathers.
You need to use Jesus Christ as a kind of corrective to the erroneous viewpoints that some of the Old Testament authors may have had. And so looked at one way, you could say, well, that's a kind of errantism. It doesn't uphold the full inerrancy of Scripture. Looked at another way, and this is more the way Pope Benedict would seem to articulate things, where the inspiration of Scripture lies is not in the individual words of a text. You have to you have to take texts in the overall context of the Bible.
So again, that's something that for us who believe in inspiration and inerrancy in the Catholic side of things, that's something that I don't think the Dark Magisterium takes into account, is that when we're talking about infallibility and we're talking about inerrancy and we're talking about inspiration, we're not saying that inspiration is each individual word. Like the author has their intentions, the editors and compilers have their intentions. What God is doing is preventing them from spreading misinformation that would hurt the overall inspiration of the Bible and the text that the councils and the rabbinical groups and the church as a whole and the Jewish people as a whole accept are those as orthodox, are those texts that don't push against inerrancy, but actually support inspiration, but actually support the overall message. So this story is important to the overall context and to the overall development of the understanding of God that we need. And without this understanding, without understanding how God relates to us in times of war, we can't understand how God relates to us in times of peace. I agree completely with Pope Benedict on this. I may not have liked him all the time on his papal stuff that he did, but I loved him on his theology. There's almost nothing that I've read of his that I disagree with theologically. I think he's one of the best theologians we've ever had as a pope, and I really love his works. So,
including Jesus Christ, to figure out their ultimate meaning. And so Pope Benedict would say the text is inerrant, but inerrancy doesn't operate on the verbal level. Instead, it operates on the level of the entirety of God's.
Yeah, it operates on the contextual level and not on the individual linguistic words that are being used.
Revelation. When you take it as a whole, it is inerrant.
Yeah, just to chime in a little bit, Jimmy, and just for the audience too, when I'm nodding my head, I'm nodding that I'm understanding, not necessarily agreeing.
Yeah.
So, Jimmy, so it seems like there are three perspectives.
So I agree with Benedict and I agree with Origen, and I think John Christensen's perspective is also important in this mixture of trying to figure out what is and what isn't inspired in the text, and how inspiration works overall when connecting all these different books that are unrelated to each other and making them related to each other, how that works and how they influence our understanding when you mix them all together.
They're on offer, or at least three, right? So the
Today,
first is,
yeah.
Right, you take the literal view that, something like this, or basically what the text says happened from a first glance, or just like a kind of natural reading, I suppose. The second is a kind of, well, obviously, as you said, a spiritual reading, where the biblical author wasn't actually intending to assert this as literal historical
Yeah.
events.
Well, you've also got to think about the fact that the biblical author probably wasn't thinking about this as biblical. They weren't thinking of it as, if it is a chronicle, they're given a history probably for whoever was the king at the time. If it's a private text or a liturgical text, then it had a completely different purpose than what we're using it as now. So let's pretend it is liturgical. and you know how you have church readings, and so you'll have you have a set of readings that match up, and you're going to do the homily, you can do the preaching based on what this episode teaches about human nature and about God's relation to man when man acts in a certain way or is in a certain situation. That could be part of it. So it could be liturgical. It could be part of a lesson for an overall base, right? It could also be that it's historical, that it's, and by historical, I don't mean that it actually happened. I mean that this is a history written for a king or a story written for a group of people so they can understand their history better, even if the history is pseudo mythological, with a little bit of history sprinkled in, you know, whatever they actually knew, whatever they could grasp of their actual history. So there's different things going on there in this particular episode that's being talked about.
Now, I'd push back a little bit there, because that's the original, what you had with some early Christian writers like Origen, was a pure spiritualizing of the text that ignored the literal sense and just didn't deal with it.
I don't agree with Jimmy's take on that, because I don't think Origen did poorly on his explanation. I really love, like, originally, honest truth, I was going to just buy all John Christensen commentary, and I wasn't going to really dive into the other church fathers. But then I read one thing by Origen, I think it was from Genesis, and I was hooked. I was like, no, I got to read everything by Origen. And so far, I've loved everything I've read from Origen so far. And I really think it's a shame that a lot of people consider him a heretic.
More modern version is not a pure spiritualizing approach. It is not a spiritualizing approach, because what it's trying to do is understand what the human author's intent was. And the human author's intent was not to say God literally commanded this. Sure. So I would kind of summarize the three positions this way. The first one would say God really did command Canaanite extermination, and it's okay. Mm-hmm. The second position would be
theory.
God didn't literally command Canaanite extermination, and the human author knew that, or at least wasn't claiming that God literally
So spiritual interpretation
really commanded this. And then the third is God did not command it, but the human author did not understand that. But we do understand it now in the light of Christ.
a progressive revelational interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, before we continue, at least the first two readings arguably could still, I mean, obviously the first one, but the second one could still be compatible with inerrancy if one holds to inerrancy.
In the classical form.
Sure.
And the third one is compatible with inerrancy if you relocate inspiration to apply to the entirety of God's revelation rather than to the individual words of a passage.
Which would be Benedict's approach, and it's an approach that I respect greatly.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. But then of course with that third one you could understand it in a way that allows for errancy.
Yeah, you could have you can have a restricted inerrancy that just says these moral claims in the Old Testament are wrong. But that would be, if you say that, then you are deviating from the more historic Christian understanding.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
I've never understood how we're deviating from a historical understanding if we're going back to authors who are ecumenical councils that consider themselves Christians, and that other people of their time, and even times recently after their life, consider them also Christian. I mean, if you want to go with Bart Ehrman's terminology, where you have, he doesn't call it pseudo-orthodoxy. What does he call it? Pre-orthodoxy, something like that. So this would be, the Christian opinion pre-consulary opinions of the church, or maybe even the pre-solidification of orthodoxy, an opinion, a pre-solidified orthodox opinion. Maybe something like that.
It almost sounds like you could actually articulate four, but it's like the third one is split into two, right? So there's a lot of nuances
or five if you want to split the second one into two.
Right. And then even I know some people who take kind of a skeptical theist approach, and they say, I don't know, but I trust God, and so I'll walk with God on this issue. So I mean, there's
I would say that's not really a position. That's not an explanation. That's just that's agnosticism on what these passages mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So then, at least what we're talking about are people who are actually saying something about the text rather than kind of being hands off with it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Okay. So, Jimmy, before we continue, I just want to ask you too, what do you think about going to the first perspective, William Lane Craig's use of divine command theory here? I know that you had some comments, and I was just interested to have you flesh those out more.
Yeah, so I had a few thoughts. Now, so just again for context, this came up because Bill Craig did an interview with Alex O'Connor, in which Alex O'Connor asked him about this. Apparently, this goes back to a feud between Richard Dawkins and Bill Craig, where Dawkins has been challenged to debate Craig, and he said he's not interested in doing that. And over time, he's offered different reasons for why he's not interested. And most recently, he's apparently said, well, I would never debate Bill Craig because he's a genocide defender, and that's just off the table for me. And that's a BS excuse. He's making excuses there, for reasons we don't have to take time to go into right now. But that's a nonsense excuse. That's not the real reason he doesn't want to debate Bill Craig. However, then Alex O'Connor, because Dawkins had said this on O'Connor's show, O'Connor then invited Bill Craig on to respond, and they talked about this. And in this, Bill Craig essentially defended the first of the three positions. And in terms of how he did in that, I think he could have done it better. He, in a couple of respects. One respect was the way he phrased things in terms of God's rights. Now, actually here, he's following the way Christians have traditionally expressed this, including people like Aquinas. They'll talk about God as a king, and he's got these rights, and so if he says it's okay to do, then it's okay to do. I have found that modern people respond to a different language. It's not factually different, but it helps them get over the conceptual hurdle if you say it like this. All life is a gift from God. So instead of talking about God's right to take a life, I'm putting the emphasis elsewhere and noting it's all a gift. He didn't have to create us. He didn't have to give us life. All life is a gift. And therefore, it's up to God as the giver of that gift to determine how much physical life a person is going to receive. Now, in fact, he's given all of us everlasting life. So he's given all of us, and in fact, given the fact we're going to be resurrected, there's an infinite amount of physical life for us in the future. But it's up to him to determine how much of our initial physical life, how long that lasts. We don't have a right to any particular amount. And so it's up to him to determine how long our initial physical lives are, how much of the gift of physical life he gives us at this phase of our existence. And he can therefore determine the circumstances in which it is, in which one expires. And if he chooses to authorize the Israelites to end the lives of various people, this is just the mechanism by which he is determining the end of how much of this gift of life they are receiving. And
So I just want to go over this again because it seems to come up a lot. And mind you, this is my interpretation of the literature, so don't think you're going to find this exact list somewhere. But so we have 5 senses of interpretation that are usually used. You have the literal, the spiritual, the allegorical, the typological, and the anagological. And basically that breaks down to the historical method. This is going to be Christian Sum, Theodore, Augustine, Luther. And then you have a spiritual or moral sense of the terminology, and this is going to be, I would say, allegorical. You have a spiritual sense, which is going to be Origen. You're going to have the allegorical, which this is going to be allegory, analogy, metaphor. This is, again, Origen. You have the topological, which is going to be the moral, ethical. This is Origen and Jerome. And Jerome will later distance himself from some of this because he will be accused of being an Origenite. I believe that's what the heresy is. There was a group of people who would over-spiritualize the Bible. And unfortunately, it would, after Origen's death, it would mar his name. The anagological, this is going to be Origen and Cassian. And then you have other interpretations. This is the liturgical, which is Augustine, mystery, which is like Eastern Orthodox versions of interpretation. And then you have the typological, which this is, you see this a lot in the Bible. Peter, Paul, Jesus, Mark, Matthew, and John all use this. And then you have the theoral or the mystical. This is also Eastern Orthodox, but also other orthodoxies such as Coptic, Ethiopian, Russian Orthodoxy. You're going to see that there. And then the genres, which we've gone over before. Okay, I just wanted to recap on that just so that way there's no confusion here about what we're talking about.
Find that explaining it that way helps various individuals get over the hump of this of this conceptually, because they're not thinking of it in terms of God as a human.
And just to be clear, Protestants do not approve of those methods. They're going to go with only the historical, only the literal. Although there has been some work being done by Gavin Ortlund to pull Protestants into reading the Bible in these other ways, specifically in the Augustinian and the Origen version. So the spiritualization and the liturgical version. I don't know if that's going to work, but yeah, that's what Ortlund is trying to do. He's trying to take them out of the ultra literalism that they're stuck in, because obviously that doesn't comply well with what we know about modern science and history.
King or dictator who is issuing orders, so much as they're recognizing, oh wait, actually everything I've got is a gift from God. And
also using a simplistic literal history limits the amount or the type of apologetics you can do toward a work to justify it.
it's easier to understand, well, of course, how big the gift is that's up to God. You don't have a right to a bigger gift than what I receive. And so I find that helps, that way of framing the issue can help modern people. So I think Bill Craig, even though he's following an established tradition in terms of talking about God having the right to do these things, I think the gift language is actually more helpful for moderns when articulating the first position. The second thing that I would say about how he did, he confessed himself to be a divine command theorist, believing that the way he articulated, he said, morality is grounded in God's nature, and then it's communicated to us through divine commands that do have to be consistent with God's nature. But he still seemed to leave a lot of freedom for God. Now, I would agree that morality is rooted in God's nature. God is love, and love is the essence of morality.
So the lady who was on Bart Ehrman's podcast earlier today YouTube channel. She was talking about how she disagrees with the whole God is love concept. But again, these are theological framings that develop out of the tradition, and the tradition is what gives us the Bible. So tradition came before the Bible, and the events came before the tradition. So first the thing happened, then people talked about it, then people wrote about it. That's the order of events that took place for it to be in a manuscript in the first place. It was written, it was talked about, and then it happened. Okay, that's not the order of events, and that's why Protestant sola scriptura is self-refuting. First it happened, then people talked about it, then people thought it was important enough to write down. That's the order of events of how things get recorded.
And there are things that we are morally obligated to do that flow from divine commands rather than just nature, whether divine or human. For example, getting baptized. God, that was a choice. He could have had us, redeemed in some other way under ordinary circumstances than by getting baptized. But he chose baptism. And so that's the way in which we are incorporated into the love of God. So I think there are some examples where you can only appeal to a divine command. You can't appeal to divine nature or human nature as this requires baptism, because God could have done it another way. But Craig seemed to have a much more expansive understanding of what God could do, as if his own nature, as if most moral commands didn't flow from a
William Lane Craig kind of, when he's talking about what God can and can't do, or what God will and won't do or ought to do, he seems to have more of an Islamic understanding of how God functions. So if you don't know about Islam, God is the greatest liar, God is the greatest trickster, God is the greatest deceiver. Those are the things they say about Allah. So it's important to understand that the God of Islam is limitless. He can rewrite time. He can change events. Our God, the God that we have out of theology, created rules that he will not break. So it's important to understand that theology there is very different. And trying to place either of these theologies back into the minds of the writers of the Hebrew texts, who are writing long before the development of theology is what it is today, is tricky. So the argument is that, according to orthodoxy, this is orthodoxy in general, is that our understanding is the correct understanding going back as far back as we can go. So as far back as the proper understanding could be understood, this is the correct understanding. And when we argue it out, we're arguing about different types of understanding, and we settle and make a decree about what the proper understanding was. So we don't go with, we don't go off the rails. That's a huge claim, and we can only make that claim because we believe that the councils are inspired, so they're protected from error by making these declarations, and only the ones that are correct are the ones that are inspired and are protected. It gets a little tricky.
Combination of divine and human nature, and God could just command anything. And I think that's mistaken. I think that most moral commands are rooted in the love ethic that is in divine nature, but they're also rooted in human nature in terms of how do humans interact with love and express.
And again, while you can't find threads of this in the Bible, this is a theological development that comes out of these threads from the Bible. So yes, these threads are in the Bible. But there are also other threads that could be picked up and dropped down or recontextualized because of these threads. So when debating these things, whether it's Jewish rabbinical fathers, whether it's Maimonides, whether it's John Chrysostom and Augustine in later time periods, they're having to wrestle with these seeming contradictions, and they're having to put them within context of each other.
Love. And that's something that varies from between different species. If you're a human, well, okay, given the facts of human biology, we bear these offspring that have ginormous heads that have to fit through a woman's pelvis. And that means human offspring are born incredibly weak and defenseless compared to those of other creatures. They're much more immature. If you look at a deer and a deer gives birth, if you watch nature documentaries, you'll see the young deer, the fawn, within an hour or so, it's up and running around. Well, it takes human babies a couple of years to get to the point they can stand up and run around confidently. And it takes 2 decades for a human child to mature and become an adult. And since children need care while they're immature, that means their parents need to stay together for decades. We're not like fish where, the female lays the eggs and the male fertilizes them and then they swim off. With humans, the parents need to stick together for decades in order to successfully raise offspring. And that means we need marriage. And so marriage is something that falls out of human nature as a way to express love for each other and for the children and for, in a broader sense, for society. So I think that most moral commandments are in this category. They aren't just divine fiats like baptism. Instead, they are something that human nature determines how we are meant to express our love, which is rooted in divine nature. And I don't think that Craig came across with that kind of an understanding. He seemed to think God could command almost anything, and somehow it would still be reconcilable with the idea that God is loving. And I thought that there were legitimate grounds for criticism of what Craig said there.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, Jimmy. And also, how's my volume? Is it okay?
It's a little loud, but it's certainly not hard to hear.
Okay, let me fix that just real quick. How's this? Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to keep it here. You can call it like perfect being ethics. I think you mentioned this in the interview. What is the divine natural law? Mm-hmm. Can we say things about the divine nature where God would not command, for example, that I can go and torture children for fun because he's issued a divine command? Could I actually say, this isn't a divine command, or I can tell based on the nature of the command that this isn't the source, that God isn't the source of the command? I mean, it seems like you would want to be able to say those kinds of checks and balances.
Yeah, and this is something I pointed out on Capturing Christianity, is, Abraham, when dealing with the Sodom and Gomorrah issue, Abraham turns to God and is hoping to negotiate him down from, I'm just going to wipe out these cities, to, well, if I can find a certain number of righteous people there, then I'll tolerate the wicked for the sake of the righteous. And Abraham in pressing this point home in Genesis,
I'll be right back.
He acknowledges God is the judge of the earth, and he says, will not the judge of the earth do right? You don't destroy the righteous with the wicked. And so I think that it is possible to look at various moral intuitions that we have and say, yeah, God couldn't command that. Just like Abraham correctly understood, God could not simply destroy all the righteous with the wicked. And so I think that although we have to be very careful and we have to think in a sophisticated way about exactly what is the nature of the moral act that's being proposed in a given circumstance, I think it is possible to look at least certain basic core intuitions and exclude them from things that God could actually command.
Yeah, and I'll just say very quick before we move on to the next question, this was actually something that I wanted to do originally in my undergrad, look into a divine theory of ethics. And see what are certain things that we would know based on the fact that God is.
But the question then becomes, how are you not just inventing your own God in your own mind?
the good itself or being itself or ipsum esse subsistens, what are some things that we can say would be impossible for him to command given his nature? So I think that the other approach of just saying he could just command anything willy-nilly, that also is kind of an extreme from what I can tell. I think we want to say something maybe closer to the middle or somewhere in between, right?
Yeah. Now, in trying to steelman Craig's position, I think that
I feel like I might have covered part of this before, but that's okay.
Craig would agree that God can't just command anything because he acknowledges that God's own nature is the standard ultimately. And so I think Craig would agree that God can't just command anything. But what I would say is I don't know that he has a coherent account of exactly what God could and could not command. But then I haven't fully fleshed that out either. So I could be open to the same charge. But my sense is that Craig is much more flexible about what he thinks God could command compared to what most people would think God could command.
Yeah, Jimmy, I 100% appreciate that clarification because I think that's what I was trying to get at, but I was kind of going about it in a roundabout way. But yeah, there is this question on, I think Craig, wants to say that because, of course he's not going to want to say that God can just command things willy-nilly. He wants to say that because God is the good and his nature is such that, his commands follow from his nature, right? And that means something because he's good, because he's love. Because I think he holds to this exemplar theory that God exemplifies the good and so on and so forth.
And to give an illustration of how Craig might attempt to flesh it out, how this is upholding the good in these situations, and there are little snatches of this in his interview, but he could say, well, look, the Canaanites were engaged in horrible evil practices, and the Canaanites who were old enough to be responsible for these actions were ending them. That promoted the good, because it ended these practices, or would have ended these practices if the Israelites had carried these instructions out thoroughly in the land. On the other hand, even and this is something he actually did say, or pretty close to what he did say, those Canaanites who were young enough that they were not responsible for the practices of their culture, they got good too, because they got taken out of that horrible, evil environment that would have corrupted them when they grew up, and they got to go to heaven on Craig's view. And the Israelites, they also were the good was promoted for them, because if they had carried, or would have been promoted for them, because if they carried out these commands, then they wouldn't have been tempted to imitate Canaanite pagan practices later, and their history would have been different. They wouldn't have had things like the Babylonian exile, for example. And so really, on Craig's view, under this first option, this was an attempt to promote the good, both for the Canaanites and for the Israelites.
Okay, Jimmy, I want to get now to one last question, and then we'll get into...
The problem is this makes me think of Gar's dead babies argument, which is, if you just want to prevent everyone from sinning, why wouldn't someone just be baptized and then have someone take the fall and just everyone go? It's the Kool-Aid problem from that stupid Heaven's Gate people. This is not a good argument. It sounds like a good argument until you put counterfactuals in front of you, and then suddenly it just doesn't work for morality as we understand it.
Into your perspective. So I know that one popular alternative to the literal interpretation, or at least, the people of this camp would consider themselves to be also within the literal vein of the scriptures. But some people think that every time it says, for example, utterly destroy them, or it says that they in fact did kill put everything to the sword, everything that breathed, basically, every living thing. And then you later see in the text, okay, they're alive, or there's some Canaanites still around. Some people will then say, oh, well, then we need to interpret this kind of language of massacre, utter massacre, indiscriminate massacre, as hyperbolic. Do you think that's a possible interpretation, or what are your thoughts on problems with that view?
Oh, no, it's clear when you read ancient Near Eastern literature, not just in Israel, but outside of Israel, that they used hyperbole in talking about battles. And they would say, go exterminate them to the last man. And that was hyperbole.
And this is 100% true. And this is where I come back in. And the first 2 or 3 times I read this part of the Bible, it just didn't bother me because of this. Because I had spent the majority of my college years reading ancient Greek history and ancient Roman history and some Babylonian history. So it just didn't bother me at all because I've read the other texts surrounding the culture. So, and also I read a lot of Egyptian stuff as well, or some Egyptian stuff.
Or looking back on a battle, we exterminated them to the last man, and that was hyperbole. You see this, for example, in Egyptian literature, and it's not confined to Egyptian literature, but you see it in Egyptian literature, for example, in an artifact known as the Merneptah stela. Merneptah was one of the pharaohs after Ramesses the Great, shortly after Ramesses the Great, and he did battle. He invaded the Levant, which is the area connecting Africa to Europe. It's where Israel is, and he invaded that area and kicked butt. which was actually one of Pharaoh's jobs. What pharaohs would do is they would, rather than build stuff at home in Egypt, they would go conquer somebody and take all their stuff. That was you're expected to do that if you were Pharaoh. They were kind of like the go old. They didn't make stuff themselves all the time. They would just acquire it from.
Yeah, I definitely covered this part of this before. So it kind of reminds me of how there are some Egyptian texts where the king says he won a victory, but if you look at what he's describing a tactical retreat. So yeah, it's just funny.
From others. And so Merneptah has, been being a good pharaoh. He's attacked a foreign land to get their stuff, and he puts up a monument, which pharaohs do, to commemorate how great he is. And he names the different people that he's conquered on this military expedition, the people he's fought battles with and beaten. And he uses hyperbolic language. When he gets down to Israel, and this is like the actual first mention of Israel in the archaeological record, when Merneptah gets down to Israel, he says, Israel's seed is not. Well, that would mean you killed all the Israelites, including their children. But that clearly didn't happen. He didn't exterminate Israel, but he's using exterminatory language about Israel. And we see the same thing in Scripture where we have exterminatory language used in some passages. But then it turns out, well, no, there's still Canaanites or different subgroups of Canaanites that we've been told were the objects of being placed under the ban, like the Amalekites. And then it turns out, there's still some Amalekites later. So we obviously have some typical ancient Near Eastern hyperbole at work here in the text.
Right. I suppose that, at least personally for me, just to express some of my opinion, whenever you have hyperbole, it's typically because there's a truth.
And I honestly can't remember what the Jewish commentary says on this. I've read so much. It's not a story that particularly interested me when I first read it. The Canaanite destruction of the Canaanites. I didn't really care. And then in subsequent readings, I'd read more commentary. I know I've read the Jewish commentary on this, but and there's a lot of Jewish commentary. I'm not going to say I've read every single Jewish commentary, but I know I read at least 3 different, I'm going to call them rabbinical fathers. So I've been calling them the whole time on my channel. I'm going to use the same term. I've read at least 3 different rabbinical fathers commentary on this, and I can't remember what they said at all. All I know is that it was compatible with the Catholic commentary that I had read.
Truth that's being stretched, right? So, for example, like if you say...
But I would say truth being emphasized.
Okay, emphasized. But for example, if you say like, the Chiefs totally slaughtered, I forget what the other team was actually this year's Super Bowl. But anyway, the Chiefs totally slaughtered the other team, right? Well, using like violent language, but obviously not meant to be taken fully literally.
Right.
But I suppose, Jimmy, I think for me at least, the problem is that when the text...
Well, I mean, one of the issues there is that even if it's hyperbole, at this time in the propagandistic context, it was meant to be taken literal, even if in actuality it was not literal. So that's another problem that you're kind of skipping over, is that the king wanted you to believe this is true, even if it was false. They wanted you to believe that they really did slaughter all these people, even if they didn't. So that's another aspect that's not being considered here.
Really does go out of its way to make it look as if women and children were in fact killed. I'm kind of wondering, like, does the text really allow you to be hyperbolic about these things? Like maybe they didn't kill every man, woman, and child, but can't you say some?
Yeah, so I think that so here's where we're kind of bridging into the second of the 2 major options today, and this is the one that I prefer. This is my preferred. I mean, I'll mention all 3 of them to people and let them make up their own mind about how they want to take these texts. But this happens to be the one I prefer. And so the way I would articulate it, I would say, okay, the first thing we have to do in figuring out what the human author is trying to do is situate the text in its historical context. Now, texts like the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, which was written in the same basic time period as Deuteronomy, because it sinks into the same book, it's got the same outlook and so forth. So they're all basically written within the same time.
I'm going to keep playing. I can hear it.
Now, if these were really written by Moses and his immediate successors, then that would tend to favor the literal interpretation that we've already discussed, because these would have been commands that were actually given to the Israelites as they were coming into the Promised Land. But in fact, most scholars have concluded that these, even though they may have elements in them that go back to Moses, they weren't actually written by him. And in fact, they never claim to be written by him. If you read them, there are various. They never say Moses wrote this whole book. It may say Moses said this or Moses wrote that, but it's an individual passage. It's not the whole book. The whole book never claims to be written by Moses, and there are indications that it was written later. One of the most famous is probably Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy, where it says, he died without coming into the Holy Land, and no one knows on this mountain, and no one knows where his tomb is to this day. God, buried him or whatever, and. Well, obviously, people have said, well, it doesn't look like Moses wrote that because it's talking about stuff after he died. Well, you'll also notice it says to this day. And that's not the only place in the Pentateuch where you find that phrase. There are various other passages that also talk about how things are still the same way to this day, suggesting they were written sometime after the event that you're reading about in the Pentateuch. And so the question is then, well, when would these have been written? Now, the majority opinion among modern scholars is that they weren't written until quite some centuries later. It'll vary depending on the source theory that the author is proposing, but they'll say that the elements that are now the Pentateuch got written sometime between the 800s BC and like the 500s or 400s BC, after the Babylonian exile. That's not my position. I would say that the best evidence suggests these were written about 1000 BC, around the time of the United Monarchy, particularly the time of David and Solomon. And so I tend to date them earlier than most scholars do, but it's still not the Exodus generation. And so on either of these views, whether you have like my earlier dating or the more common scholarly dating, these are written hundreds of years after the events in question. And so you have to ask, well, what is the historical author trying to communicate to the audience that he's writing for? Is he trying to communicate that God literally said, wipe them out, all of them, including the kids? Or is he more concerned with communicating to the audience, have nothing to do with paganism? Well, I think the latter is quite arguable. I think that's the author's primary concern in these texts, is he's wanting to inoculate his own generation against making compromises with paganism. And the way he's doing that is by depicting God as giving very harsh, exceptionalist instructions to an earlier generation about how to deal with pagans. So that's a kind of a general sketch of this. And I would note that this position is actually the one that's endorsed by the Pontifical Biblical Commission. Back in 2008, Pope Benedict had a synod on the Word of God. And one of the things that came out of that synod was a request for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to undertake a study of the inspiration and truth of sacred Scripture. And so what the CDF did, is they tasked the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which is not actually part of the magisterium, but it's an advisory body of scholars that's run by the CDF. In fact, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was also the head of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and the Pontifical Biblical Commission's documents can only be published if the magisterium approves them. And
so I have a lot of Catholic stuff, obviously, but I want to recommend Maimonides, just in general. Let's see. I was looking for Joshua. I didn't spot him in my right now when I went through the books, and I was taking a little bit too long. But I'm going to recommend you go ahead and get hold on. I've had several Jewish viewers try to correct me on my pronunciation. The Chumash. I'm going to recommend this one. This is beautiful. This is one of my favorite. It's absolute favorites. We do also have this one, the Tanakh. This is just good. It does have commentary. It's not as in depth as these larger. So each one of these are different sections, and each one is about $50 to $60. And there's about 12 or 13 different collections like this. These are very expensive, but they have a junk ton of really good Jewish commentary. This, on the other hand, does still have commentary, but it's kind of more like study Bible commentary. You know what I mean? Like it's not really in depth, but it's good. And then the other one that I like is this one. This one has a lot of good commentary. This is a little bit more academic, a little less spiritual in its understanding, a little less traditional. Not bad though. Just to get the Jewish perspective on these things.
So they tasked the Pontifical Biblical Commission with writing a document on the inspiration and truth of sacred Scripture. It's called The Inspiration and Truth of Sacred Scripture, and it deals with these passages. It has a whole section on violence in the Old Testament, and within that, it has a section on the ban, cherem, the concept we've been talking about. And it essentially makes the same points I've been making. It says these texts were written long after the events that the text is describing, and they should not be taken as literal accounts of history, but as a kind of stylized version of history to teach a later generation of Israelites.
I do think it's interesting that Jimmy is saying this, because when I set this a while back. I know a viewer of mine called into his show, and he tore the viewer apart. But now Jimmy is saying this. But they have not just Jimmy Akin. Maybe it might be a thing with Catholic Answers. They have done a very ugly disservice to the Catholic Study Bible, specifically the one from Oxford, where they talk against it, and they talk against the NAB Study Bible. The NAB Bible that's produced by the U.S. United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCB. They talk against it because of the notes that say exactly what Jimmy is saying. So I don't know if Jimmy Akin's opinion has changed. I'm not really sure. Hold on. We have a comment in the chat. This is from Selah. It is a shame that the Prime Minister of Israel explicitly referenced these verses to slaughter the Palestinians. We're not exactly talking about that currently, but I do think that is part of the discussion here. I know, for instance, there's some description of tactics used during these battles, whether it's with David and Saul or David versus the Canaanites, that were actually used by American and British soldiers when they were fighting in Israel during World War I and World War II. And they actually use the tactics and description of the land as it is shown up in the Bible, and they were able to find certain paths that are used in the Bible, and they were using the same path and the same tactics as real warfare. So there is a note of realism here. There is a familiarity with the land, familiarity with actual war tactics that are involved in this. So just like the Iliad, just because there's a mythos around it, and there's a mythology that developed and a legend that developed, or a mythos that developed out of the legend that surrounds the events, that doesn't mean there's not actual real facts. So these are real warfare. This is real strategic warfare that was used at a certain time period. It just might not be reflective of the warfare that actually was happening at that time. So some of the strategies and some of the capabilities and technology that is reflected in these passages are anachronistic to the time period that they were talking about, but not anachronistic to the time period the authors were writing.
Moral messages like have nothing to do with paganism. So this isn't just a theory that is held by Jimmy Akin. This is a theory that is held by other scholars and in fact is endorsed by the scholars on the Pontifical Biblical Commission. So I'm not sure if I answered every aspect of your question there, but if I didn't, you can let me know and I'll have another bite at the apple.
No, you're good. So I think
sorry, apple bobbing reference, not Genesis.
Mention what your preferred approach is. And so let me just try to summarize what you said and ensure that I've understood what you're saying, and then let me know if I missed anything. So you take the spiritual reading, in that you think...
No, I'm taking a historical reading of the literal sense of the text. I'm saying that the literal sense that the author was of what the author was trying to communicate was not exterminate the Canaanites to a person. It was the literal sense. The message he's trying to communicate to his audience is...
So when you hold a lot of the Catholic apologists' feet to the fire, it gets very tricky for them, because as Catholics, we are not bound to the same definition of inerrancy and inspiration that Protestants are bound to. Protestants are stuck with the five solas, and they can't get away from them. And because of that, it really does affect their ability to spiritualize or allegoricalize difficult passages. They're bound to a literal interpretation of the Bible. As Catholics, we are not. As long as we don't deny or contradict any of the major dogmas, and we don't hold publicly opinions that would scandalize the church, about the Bible, we are good. So that becomes very difficult for an apologist that's trying to hold the line of acceptability in the Catholic community. So I do feel for Jimmy, because I think Sona did have a good understanding of what Jimmy said, but Jimmy can't say what Sona said Jimmy said, which becomes a difficulty, one that I've run into many times on my channel.
Have nothing to do with paganism.
So I guess I might have been misunderstood what you meant by the modified spiritual reading.
I didn't use that phrase. This is not a spiritual reading.
Okay.
Spiritual readings ignore the literal sense of the text. That's the big criticism of the spiritualized readings you find in the Church Fathers, is they're ignoring the literal sense. I am not ignoring the literal sense.
And I am going to go with the Church Fathers over Jimmy Akin. I don't care if I piss off Protestants. I just don't care. I probably should, but this channel is not an outreach channel to Protestants. I am talking to atheists, to anti-theists. I am talking to Muslims. I am talking to the LGBTQ community. So I am not worried about pissing off a Protestant who might have stepped into my channel for some reason. I have been on the internet for over 11 years. I have been talking religion for 7 years online as I've been going through my journey. So I am not worried about hurting the feelings of a literalist. I'm just not.
I'm trying to establish the literal sense, and I'm saying that the literal sense is something different than what you would think if you read this as a modern...
Selah, thank you, brother. I greatly appreciate you saying that. That means a lot to me. I've had more and more messages about that from many of my viewers. Not least of all was Lisa a few days ago. And thank you. I'm grateful that I am pulling you might be the wrong way, that I am directing you closer to Christianity. And I appreciate your viewing. And may you have peace with God. And thank you so much. That means a lot.
person take without reference to its historical context.
Okay, I think I misunderstood something you said when you said the second approach.
This is a modified version of the second approach. Yeah.
And the second approach was the spiritual reading?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So what I'm doing is regrounding. So the conclusion, I would say, that this is teaching a spiritual lesson is correct.
Right.
But I'm regrounding it in the literal sense of the text instead of simply ignoring the literal sense of the text.
Because, yeah, and what you're saying is the author himself is not necessarily saying that
Kill 'em all.
the author is trying to communicate a spiritual point.
Yeah.
And if you look at the letter and the historical context of the text, so to speak, it becomes apparent that that's what he's doing.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so then, yeah.
Yeah, he's not literally giving instructions to kill Canaanites because he's not talking to that generation. He's talking to his own generation, and his own generation was not in a position. They were already in the land. You know, these were all...
And I think that's the strongest point. I'm actually going to replay that again because I think that's the most important point about this, is that when it was written when there was not a possibility for these actions to actually take place. This is not a command to the audience that was actually receiving these texts. This is an interpretation of events that may or may not have happened, that at least from the author's point of view did happen. And it could be propaganda for the king that supports the king's point of view. So he is submitting to a higher authority than himself when he's writing this, which is funny. Okay, let's go back and let's hear that again. I'm going to slow it down just a bit so we can get all of Jimmy Akin saying that and we can hear it clearly, and then I'll go back to the speed we've been doing.
The author is trying to communicate a spiritual point.
Yeah.
And if you look at the letter and the historical context of the text, so to speak, it becomes apparent that that's what he's doing.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so then, yeah.
He's not literally giving instructions to kill Canaanites because he's not talking to that generation. He's talking to his own generation, and his own generation was not in a position. They were already in the land. You know, these were all, whatever happened with the Canaanites, that's in the past. The Pontifical Biblical Commission even argues that the Canaanite groups were no longer identifiable. at the time these texts were written. I'm not fully persuaded.
And I think that's a very strong point from the Vatican and from the Catholic Church, is that because of mixed breeding, interbreeding, and the way that natural integration happens between cross cultures that live in the same land, you couldn't tell the difference between a Canaanite and an Israelite. Genetically, they're the same people at some point. So, yeah, it doesn't even make sense. At this point, the Canaanites have been spiritualized or allegoricalized to the ancient enemy, whatever the ancient enemy was. This is cowboys and Indians. This is cops and robbers. There's no longer a real individual tribe or person you're actually fighting. You're just put in a placeholder. This is the British versus the United States. Anytime we talk about the Revolutionary War, they're just the generic bad guys. This is the German people I can't say without getting my video suppressed. This is them. This is just a generic bad guy now. It's no longer a real individual person that's being persecuted here. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Okay.
Persuaded of that, but it's going to depend on the dating you use, among other things. But I think the point is accurate that the author of the texts was not literally giving instructions to a generation that was already dead. He's trying to communicate in his own day to his own audience. And I think that the understanding of have nothing to do with paganism is the most plausible understanding, or at least arguably, it's the most plausible understanding of these just wipe out pagans texts that can't actually be applied by his modern audience.
Yeah, and I just want to apologize, Jimmy, because when you said modified second, I thought, okay, modified spiritual, but you're like doing your I wanted to get into, but let me just first ask you kind of these three sub questions. And I know that you've talked about these, but I just want to make it real clear for the audience. So just first, really quick, what does the archaeological data suggest about the conquest of Canaan?
This is disputed. There's a range of opinions in biblical archaeology, and there are sort of three groups. There are the biblical minimalists who think that almost nothing, I mean, these people would even question the existence of King David. They would think almost nothing in the Old Testament is historically reliable until maybe the very end. Then there are the biblical maximalists who would say, no, this is a fundamentally accurate record. And then there are people who are kind of in the middle. So when you look at the questions about the coming into Canaan, there are a lot of scholars, including non-Christian ones, who will say, yeah, we have some evidence for the Exodus. It looks like this really happened. And in fact, I have used an argument that, to my knowledge, I've somewhat pioneered, of using the criterion of embarrassment to argue for the reality.
I think the criterion of embarrassment is the worst, is the lowest and worst standard for whether or not something is true. I know a lot of people use it. I don't think Jimmy should be giving himself credit for using it because it's been used a lot. But I don't think that's a good criteria.
This is for the reality of the Exodus, because when you look at national origin stories for different people, if they've been around in a land for a long time, they tend to say things like, "Oh, we've always been here," or the gods put us here, or something like that.
Like Jimmy, I read a lot of comic books and a fair amount of fiction, not as much as probably Jimmy reads, but I read a lot of comic books, so I know this is not a good argument. What is the COE? B.S. Lewis says the COE is embarrassing, so it must be true, Alpha. I don't know what the COE is.
That. You don't say, we were slaves until recently, and then we escaped and came here. That's not a glorifying thing to say. It's glorifying your ancestors to say, oh, the gods put us here. It is not glorifying your ancestors to say, we were a subjugated people who escaped. And so that, since you will tend to be honest when you say something embarrassing.
Wow, I lost the first word of that. I literally did, of embarrassment. The criteria of embarrassment. That's what you're saying. The criteria of embarrassment is embarrassing, so it must be true. Wow.
Embarrassing about yourself.
That well wasn't dedicated to you, BS. That was dedicated to me being brain foggy.
as opposed to something glorifying yourself. The criterion of embarrassment, which is often used in biblical studies, would suggest the Exodus is a real event. This is not.
For the secular scholars out there who sometimes peruse my channel, if you do get to this part, is the criteria embarrassment an actual standard that actual scholarly, academic level, professional biblical scholars use? That's what I want to know. Is criteria embarrassment actually a criteria? Is it actually a standard? Because it's the worst one I've ever heard.
The kind of story you would make up about your ancestors. And so for that and other things like the Merneptah Stela, which has I won't go into the details, but the linguistics in the Merneptah Stela that I mentioned earlier speak of it.
As a writer, anybody can make up anything. So this is not a good. Anytime you hear in any story, you literally just can't make this stuff up, that writer is being lazy.
Israel as if it is not yet a settled people. It's not yet a people that has an established territory. It's still roaming around.
B.S. Lewis, if you're currently watching Tux, also if you're still here, I recommend you guys start arguing with Jim Lotus. He is a friend of mine, I believe. I believe it is him. He believes in flat Earth. He believes in almost all conspiracy stories, and he also believes in ancient aliens. Feel free to go at it. I would love for you guys to debate. He might have to. I might have to build him an avatar, so that way he won't show his face on stream. But you're welcome to debate him on my channel at any time, if this is the gentleman who I think he is.
And
when I say friend, I don't mean internet friend. I mean a personal friend in my personal life, IRL.
I think with all that, we actually have good evidence the Exodus occurred. And I actually have an episode of Mysterious World about that if people want to check that out. But when it comes to specific things that we read, like in the book of Joshua, like, for example, the conquest of Jericho and Ai, two of the big towns that they go after. We don't have evidence of Jericho's walls falling down. Jericho is believed to be actually...
That's a great point. That's something I keep on wanting to bring up every time they bring up Jericho. BS, if it is my friend, don't be nice to him. He's a terrible, terrible person.
The oldest city in world history, and we have done a lot of archaeology.
If he's not my friend, then he's a great person. But if he is my friend, no. Anyway,
Logical work there. We don't have evidence of its wall.
Back to what I was saying. So the Jericho did not the evidence of walls. There's no evidence that the walls actually collapsed. So when secular scholars get really upset about the hypothetical deaths that occurred inside the walled city, it's like, but that story didn't happen, at least not in that way.
Walls literally falling down in the right time frame. That's another thing that may be hyperbole, as the Pontifical Biblical Commission suggests it is. When it comes to AI, which they then conquer, there's a dispute.
BS, me and you are friends. Just letting you know.
AI is a real place, but we don't find it, at least at the site that is normally thought to be AI. We don't find evidence of an invasion in the right time period. In fact, it even looks like AI was in ruins during this time period. And in fact, that's actually what the name AI means, is ruins. And so a common proposal in archaeology is that, yeah, there was a city here, it got ruined, they built a new city on top of it, and they called the new city ruins because of the ruins that were there. But there doesn't seem to be evidence of an Israelite conquest of this city in the right time frame. Now, there is an alternative theory that's been proposed, but so far I only know of one guy who advocates it, but we've misidentified the site of AI, and AI is really a different site. So
Jim, let me ask you a test question here. What is your opinion on 420?
To kind of sum all that up, we do have evidence that the Israelites moved into the
And do you think psychedelics can help your understanding of the Bible?
Holy Land, but we have a harder time establishing archaeological arguments for the details of exactly how they entered the Promised Land from the book of...
Yes, the city is called AI, and it's not spelled AI. I think it's spelled A-I-E-E or something like that. It's just the name of a place. It's just pronounced AI.
Joshua.
All right, Jimmy, another question I wanted to ask you about is...
A-I-E? A-E-I-E? Is there an H in there?
Is the church fathers. So you noted that the traditional interpretation would be something like the first position, which is, the very, which is a particular form of the literal.
Yeah. Jim, you're not doing a great job saying that I don't know you. Because that's how my friend would answer.
Yeah, God said it's what you... And part of the problem is the term literal can mean different things. But it's the basic view. God said, kill him, and it's okay.
Right. Yeah, I'm just going to go with the... I'll go with that description instead for the sake of clarity.
Yeah.
So this has been the traditional interpretation, it seems, among the church fathers, although you did note that...
Most of them, or
right.
At least after a certain point in time. But especially early on, you did have people like Origen and others who did take a spiritualizing approach, where they basically ignored the literal sense and said, this is the literal... Whatever's going on here literally is too disturbing, so what lesson can we learn from this? And that's what they focused on.
I think Jimmy Akin's doing a judgment there. I don't think the church fathers were saying that it was too disturbing.
And it wasn't just Origen. This was a common thing, actually, among many of the church fathers. But at a certain point in history, certainly by the early Middle Ages, you had a resurgence of an awareness of we've got to take the literal sense seriously. And we can't just ignore it. And that helped cause a resurgence of the kill them all, but it's okay because God said so view.
And so aside from Origen, who else could we put into this camp? I've heard some people say Gregory of Nyssa.
Yes, possible. I would think Clement of Alexandria, too. I'd have to do some checking to see the views of individual fathers. But based on their known proclivities, I would think like someone like Clement of Alexandria would likely be of this view.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned...
I don't, Jimmy. Okay, so Jimmy Akin recently, and again, he's been building this argument on his channel for years, so it's not like he came out of nowhere with it, where he was trying to say that we agree with that Catholics agree with Protestants more than Protestants understand what we do. Whatever. Him trying to distance himself from church father opinions. He did this again with my viewer who called into the show asking about the understanding of the soul that the church fathers give, and Jimmy just denied it and said that it was heretical, which it is not. It's in the Liturgy of the Hours. And I've since talked to a priest and a bishop, but through a priest to a bishop. I've since talked to a priest about this, and the priest said that my view was fine. And it was in concert or in whatever with what my bishop says. It didn't go against what the bishop says. It doesn't mean it's what my bishop thinks. It doesn't mean that my bishop is co-signing on what I said. It just simply means that what I was saying didn't go against what the bishop says. In my priest's opinion, in my spiritual advisor's opinion. And then Jimmy Akin, a few years after that, then said that he regrets how strongly he came down on that particular subject. He didn't remember the exact incident, but that he was trying to defend divine simplicity when he went that hard. And he does think he should have been more tactful. Whatever. But this seems to be a habit with Jimmy where he seems to argue with the church fathers. And now, I'm not talking about him arguing with the heretical church, with the people who are outside of the church fathers and are considered heretics nowadays. The people who are considered orthodox church fathers. He argues against them a lot. I'm not sure if that's his ego or his pride or if that's a legitimate theological development that's happened in the Catholic world that I just don't know about. There's so much stuff, it's hard to read everything.
A little bit about the magisterium. Not that the magisterium has issued any dogma or...
Oh, the magisterium hasn't taught anything about these passages and how to take them.
Right.
So there you go. He just answered that. So it's not a theological development at all. This is just Jimmy Akin's opinion going against the church father's opinion. I just wouldn't be comfortable doing that. I just would not be comfortable going up against the church fathers.
But it has allowed the Pontifical Biblical Commission to say certain positions that a Catholic could take on these issues.
Yeah.
Correct? Okay.
Yeah. It's also allowed Thomas Aquinas' view, which is the kill 'em all, but it's okay view. So the magisterium permits a range of views. I think the magisterium is more comfortable with the second view today. The magisterium is more comfortable with the second view compared to the first, which is why I think they prefer what the Pontifical Biblical Commission said to what Aquinas said. And then I haven't really seen anyone, and it may be there, I just haven't, I think Matthew Ramage.
So if I can speculate, I think because the current iteration of the Vatican and the Commission and the magisterium, I guess I should say, have pushed against Aquinas' divine command theory. I guess Jimmy feels that gives him the opening to have his opinion voiced as either equal to or at least an alternative to divine command theory. Still, it's a little dicey to go up against a church father when we say that Holy Tradition is one of the three inspired columns that protects our faith.
May have done some work in this area, but I haven't seen anybody explicitly applying the third position to these texts. But I have seen Pope Benedict doing something similar, at least articulating principles that would allow you to relocate the inspiration of Scripture to the totality of the revelation rather than just the words of particular passages. In fact, there are some comments he made along those lines, for example.
So for those that don't know, Jimmy Akin's walking a very tightrope right now because he can't say a heresy online representing the church. So he has to be very clear that he's given his own opinion. At the same time, he can't go against a current pope. No, this is not a current pope. This is Benedict, which is the previous pope. But most theologians agree with Benedict on almost everything, even in Pope Francis's pontificate. So this is... Oh, it's dicey. It's dicey. It's dicey. And when I say agree with everything, I don't mean policy-wise. I mean theologically wise. So this is Jimmy Akin's walking a tightrope right now.
In his post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Verbum Domini, which was the document he wrote following up the synod on the Word of God.
I don't read all the stuff that comes out from the Vatican. I just don't. So this is very interesting that Jimmy does, or seems to. That has to take a lot of time.
And he makes some comments along these lines there, particularly in the section on dark passages of Scripture. He also went a little further in his final book that was published after his death, called What is Christianity? In that, he's got a section, I should have it in front of me, so I'll read it to you. He's talking about differences in how Christians, Jews, and Muslims view Scripture. And he's talking in particular about the Christian Scriptures, and he says, within this diversified millennial literature, because the Christian Scriptures were written in over a millennium, there is for Christians a further qualitative subdivision, the one between the Old and New Testament.
That's a heavy admission for those that missed it.
The New Testament, too, is a collection of different books which can be understood only as a whole and in terms of this whole. For Jews, only the Old Testament is Bible. For Christians, however, it is possible to grasp the Old Testament correctly only in terms of the new interpretation that it had in the words and actions of Jesus Christ. The New Testament gives valid witness to this interpretation.
And I think this is where scholars and Catholics in general disagree. I should say non-Catholic scholars and Catholics disagree.
Two collections of texts, the Old Testament the Old and the New Testaments, refer to each other in such a way that the New Testament is the interpretive key to the Old Testament. From a Christian perspective, only in terms of the New Testament can we establish what is the lasting theological significance of the Old Testament is. For this reason, he says, it is not possible to speak about a verbal inspiration of the Bible. The meaning and the authority of the individual parts are correctly gathered only.
BS, I have no idea how to answer that question. From a Catholic perspective, no, they're not making up these rules. These are inspired. B, the dogmatic rules that stand from all the ecumenical councils put together. So they're not just making it up. They debated it. They rolled on it. They voted on it. But on a very human level, did the person who first proposed it make it up? I don't know. I don't know if his mom told him something or his dad told him something and his priest said something, and then he went and became a bishop and went to a meeting and said, "Hey, guess what?" I don't know. I don't know, BS.
And this is emphasized, from the Bible as a whole and in light of Christ's coming. So you can see how he's articulating principles where you could say, okay, if I need to take the whole of the Bible into account to have a correct understanding of these passages in the Old Testament, because Christ essentially completes and reinterprets and tells us the lasting significance of what came before, you can see how saying, okay, maybe the Old Testament incorporated some material that the human author might have believed, but that is ultimately corrected by the revelation that Christ gave us. So you can see how the principles in this passage that Benedict is articulating could be consistent.
I may or may not have left my bike outside after my workout. I lost my car keys today, by the way. I'm using my spare keys. I think I might have left my bike outside of the garage. That sucks.
Consistent with that third view, even though he's not here talking about these same passages.
Yeah, and some people have talked about how even Jesus will talk about, like when he talks about divorce in the New Testament, Jesus kind of looks back at the law of Moses and he says, look, this isn't really ideal. Mm-hmm. And God made an accommodation, or he kind of allowed this to happen, but this isn't really how it was supposed to be. So in a way, Jesus gives us the picture of the whole. And, obviously, one can say that there are elements of truth, or there are valuable things in each of the perspectives, even if you don't ultimately land in one of them, or you don't land in the other one, right? Yeah. So,
yeah, that's why I try to articulate all three for people and let them make up their own minds.
Right. Jimmy, my last question for you is, somebody might be worried that your interpretation compromises too much by way of inerrancy. How would you try to deal with that concern?
Well, I would say that my view doesn't compromise inerrancy at all. My view is the second view. I'm trying to articulate what the human author was trying to do, and I'm not saying he was wrong about anything. Someone of the third position might say that, but I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we have to be sensitive to what is the human author actually trying to communicate. And so I would say that my view is fully consistent with biblical inerrancy. What it's not is a literalistic view. But the question of, do you take a passage literalistically, or do you recognize some other sense, is a separate issue than infallibility. It's like
for the ex-Protestants, and again for any Protestant who just happens to be an hour and a half into this video and didn't jump out, is that something that you guys can discern is the wrong word, that you can create a dichotomy in your mind and your understanding of the Bible? Can a Protestant separate inerrancy from infallibility, or literalism from infallibility? Is that something that you can do mentally? Like, is that just a gymnastic flip too much for you to do mentally and still stay Protestant, still stay Christian? As a Catholic, it doesn't bother me at all. As a philosopher, even though I hate calling myself that because it doesn't feel earned. As a philosopher, it doesn't bother me at all. So it's fine for me. It fits for my understanding of the Bible, fits for my understanding of theology, fits for my understanding of my faith. I know that there are radical traditionalist radical traditionalist Catholics who are not okay with that, and they will freak out at what Jimmy Akin just said. I don't. I agree with this. This is actually my understanding of the Bible when I look at the Bible as literature first and then as history. And then above that, my framing is this is the Jewish people's understanding of their relationship, of their history and their relationship to God as told by themselves to themselves. So, the inspiration being the total context of everything put together. So, it doesn't bother me at all. But as a Protestant, is that a division you can make in your mind? Or does it have to all be literally true for it to be inspired for you? Does it have to all be literally true for it to be inerrant? I'm curious, if you're a Protestant and you hear this part, if someone wants to clip just this part and put it out there as a short so I can get some answers on this, that'd be great.
In the book of Revelation, it talks about the devil as a big red flying dragon with 7 heads. Well, guess what? The devil's an angel, so he doesn't have a body, so he's not literally a big red dragon flying around with 7 heads. That would be a literalistic understanding of the text, meaning an understanding that takes the text in a word-for-word, woodenly literal way. And we're not meant to do that with Scripture. We need to understand what the biblical author was intending. John was not attempting to tell us the devil is literally a flying red dragon with 7 heads that might show up in the sequel to Godzilla versus Ghidorah. So in the same way, we have to ask the question, what was the author of Deuteronomy and what was the author of Joshua actually trying to communicate to his audience? And we shouldn't read literalistically. If we did, then guess what? God's got a really long nose. Because one of you frequently read in the Old Testament, they don't translate it this way in English, but in the Old Testament, it frequently talks about how long God's nose is and what a great thing that is, that God has this long nose. Because in Hebrew, long nose is an idiom. It's like our English roll out the red carpet. We don't literally mean roll out a red carpet when we say, oh, there's an important person coming, we need to roll out the red carpet. Well, the Hebrews didn't literally think God had, at least most of them, at least the educated ones, didn't think God literally had a long nose. That's a Hebrew idiom for being patient. You're long of nose if you are a patient person. And so they'll talk about how God's long of nose. But if you read that literalistically, you'd think, God's got a big, huge schnoz that's bigger than Jimmy Durante's.
All right, Jimmy, I want to thank you for this. And do you have some time to take questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay, we're good. That's the end. All right. Thank you all for watching. Tomorrow we'll be doing Gavin Ortlund. I'm going to try to do both Gavin Ortlund's responses. The second one is going to be the more controversial one. And then Thursday I will be doing an open room. And on Thursday it will be covering kink and role play as relates to religion. That's going to be an interesting one to do. I will send another invitation out to Eva Lupine over Twitter. If anyone actually knows her, let her know that I'm legitimate, that I treat people politely. I don't care if you disagree with me. I'm open to different opinions, and I'm very respectful of other people's views. And see if she might want to come on. Don't berate her, please, but just let her know that I'm a legitimate person. Anyway, I love you all. Thank you all for watching. Did you watch Akin and Gavin team up against Pelagia? Yes, that's actually going to be one of the videos that I'm doing for tomorrow. So I'm going to be doing that one. Gavin's cover of Grape in the Bible, and then Gavin's coverage of defending Canaanite, ancient Israelite Canaanite warfare. So those will be the 3 videos for tomorrow. It's going to be a heavy day tomorrow, but Thursday will be a more fun one. That's what's going on there. Also, for Patreon, I'm going to start setting up a secret private Patreon video, either weekly or bi-weekly, where I will be taking your comments directly, and we'll be talking about something you all want to talk about, whatever it is you want to talk about. and that will be for patrons only. I have not set that up yet, and there are a few other paywall resources I'm going to be using for special videos and special requests, because I need money like everyone else. I gotta pay for gas and get groceries. So anyway, I love you all. I appreciate all of you. Let me give some shout outs. B.S. Lewis, you're great. Thank you for going easy on my friend, not friend, who may not know me or might know me. Jim Lotus, I'm really enjoying your fun comments in my chat. Please continue to come on. And especially if I don't know you, if you would like to come on my channel Thursday, I'm going to be having a live stream. You're welcome to come on and voice your opinions there. I would also like to give a shout out to Selah. I appreciate your words, very kind words. I want to give a shout out to Lisa. I appreciate her kind words. Tux TV, you're great. I hope to maybe guest on your channel sometime and have an argument with you there. I think that's all the shout outs that I have for today. Once again, be kind to each other, be patient with each other, and keep up the faith. Bye.
Me all the same, told me I won't make a name, but it's not about the fame, it's about keeping me sane. So I stay within my lane, feel my blood pump through my veins, feel adrenaline, no pain, welcome all to my domain. So let me break it all down for you. I ain't never giving up, I ain't never giving up. I'm taking that crown from you. I ain't worried about your, I ain't even. So let me break it all down for you. I ain't never giving up, I ain't never giving up. I'm taking that crown from you. I ain't worried about your, I ain't even. So let me break it all down for you. I ain't never giving up, I ain't never giving up. I'm